So we're going to have a panel on builders, super builders, or no builders. It's going to be moderated by Mads from Maven 11. We're going to have Max Resnick from Special Mechanism Group, Lily Johnson from Astria, and Pranav Garidmidi from A16Z Crypto.
Perfect. Thank you, Josh. So yes, just mentioned, we're talking about builders, or the lack of them, or the rise of them even further. I think maybe good to start quickly with like very, very succinct intros, like one sentence at max. And then like one interesting part about block building, doesn't have to be on Ethereum, that you want to mention, because I think we might get back to those things later on as we go on. You want to start, Max?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Max Resnick. I am the head of research at SMG, which is part of Consensus now. Interesting fact about block builders is that we only have 2 of them on Ethereum now.
Hi, my name is Lily. I am a core dev at Astria, and I also do research for application-specific sequencing. And another fun fact, close to Max, is that like our builders are typically super centralized within their like own internal systems, which is like weird because we're building like open, like permissionless systems when builders, their code is like exactly the opposite of that.
Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm a researcher at A16Z, focused on various mechanism design problems. I think as someone from a more kind of theory background, it's magical to me that like these builders work at all and that these auctions actually function like at the time scales they do. And so I think it's super fascinating to get into exactly how those work and what we can say about them.
Okay, so next steps, I think sort of setting a spectrum, because I think, other chains than Ethereum build blocks, and they build blocks in different ways. So maybe if we can sort of set the stage of how does block building work very succinctly in Ethereum, then maybe on like a shared sequence network, like are they doing the block building or is it outsourced again? And then I don't know if you want to get into like something like DAGs or something, but you can figure something out, I suppose. Max, do you want to go with the MEV boost?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that like any system that has enough MEV will eventually converge to MEV boost because that's the only system that profit maximizes for the validators, and the validators ultimately have control. On Ethereum, we have PBS. Quick overview. Basically, we have these relays that run a open English auction, and builders submit full blocks to them, and whichever block pays the highest bribe to the proposer gets selected by the proposer. The proposer signs the block header, and then the relay releases the block to the network.
Yeah, so at Astria, which is like a shared sequencer, our like network actually just handles block proposing. It does not actually like do any sort of building, but it does like enable like rollups or like app chains built on top of Astria to define their own building. So for example, like as Jordan was like mentioning in his like previous talk, it's like a highly programmable. You can do whatever you want with your EVM. What Astria does is we just like give you like a blob of transactions, and you can like order them however you want as long as the ordering is like deterministic. You can have like traditional like block builders like on this. Like for example, we are building our own like DeFi like EVM right now, and we are like building our own like builder infrastructure on top of our shared sequencer, which does the proposing.
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk about on Solana, for example, it's a weird mix of the kind of there's a default block builder and the kind of default client implementation, and that's kind of responsible for on average maybe like 3/4 of the block or half the block. And there's also kind of an off-chain auction mechanism that's kind of this more central auctioneer that kind of builds another fraction of the block. And kind of Solana works at a time scale that gives them kind of different constraints on these auctions than you might have in Ethereum, where it's harder to run kind of a more open auction. And then I guess finally for the more DAG-based stuff, there isn't really blocking of kind of being forced to do things in a more asynchronous environment kind of causes their default to just be kind of blindly committing to transactions with less of an emphasis on actually trying to pick the highest value transactions.
Can I just to follow up on this, like if you look at Solana, I will bet you, Pranav, that they will converge to PBS within a year.
Yeah, that's very possible. It's definitely harder engineering to make it happen, and so it requires just more will on those validators. But
yeah, I mean the will is basically the financial incentive, right? Like directly translated, and now we have big financial incentives. And I guarantee you, if Aptos or Sui had big financial incentives to move to block building because there was a bunch of MEV, then they would have their own version.
Yeah, so if you have financial incentives to specialize, it seems like it always trends towards being outsourced to somebody who is more sophisticated. That seems pretty bad from like a centralization standpoint and like bypassability, because now we go outside of the protocol. is this going to continue happening, or are we? Because it seems like we're going towards this where, okay, I want to do precons. Like I can't really do that with like Ethereum proposers. Let me go outside of like out of the protocol, and that seems to be happening over and over and over. Like even sequencing on like base rollups. This seems bad. Agree, disagree? Like, are we going to get these massive builders that are just getting more and more powerful, but they're outside of the protocol rules itself?
I think it's a question of what you're comparing. What's the counterfactual that you're thinking about? If the counterfactual is actually the proposers themselves would centralize without PBS and form big, Coinbase itself might have a builder in-house that does things. Well, now the attesters and the proposers are both participating in a way that might not be ideal. So in some ways, if your counterfactual is like, given there's a financial incentive to centralize here, let's quarantine the attesters away from the proposer and keep them from centralizing, then I think PBS looks favorable. But at the same time, we don't really want two entities proposing because that's a big regulatory risk for those entities.
I think that like Ethereum itself, since it's a generalized like EVM, like it's gonna need like a block builder just to figure out like how to make all the transactions like play nice together, so we don't like have to deal with like invalid transactions or transactions that are like included in the block that like cannot pay. But if you have like different types of chains, such as like application specific chains, like those don't necessarily need builders. They just need ways to get the transactions into the, I guess like the transaction like ordering rule in order for like the blocks to be produced. And like those don't necessarily need builders. They just need like relay mechanisms to get the transactions like into the block.
Pranav?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's kind of a trade-off basically on like efficiency and robustness to some extent of, like offering things like precons and having kind of builders build up like these kind of specialized parties building these blocks. Like technically does give you more like efficient use of block space in these blocks. I think the main concern is, do these parties get monopoly power eventually and then kind of abuse that monopoly power to like then degrade the efficiency? And I think right now, like it's generally in this middle ground if it's kind of okay. Like they're not doing too egregious stuff when they could be doing more egregious stuff. And I think kind of the core challenge of like designing these protocols is how do you constrain that set properly? Of how do you get the efficient outcomes that are naturally going to occur without kind of getting to a point where you have monopoly power and things go bad.
Do you want to add on that, Max? Or?
Yeah, I would just say, what is the efficiency that we're actually talking about? Because I often hear, oh, block building makes things more efficient. Yeah, efficient at extracting the maximum rent from the system for the proposer, which is not necessarily efficient for the whole system. It's just efficient for the proposer. So I think like those two things need to be separated. And whenever you hear somebody say, oh, it's the most efficient, it's actually the most efficient at extracting rent, and that's not necessarily a good thing for the system as a whole.
Yeah, so end the proposed monopoly is what you're saying.
Yeah, end it.
This monopoly of referring to, Pranav, it seems like there's game theoretical reasons for why you would not act out against this. I can also see a world where there's a specific day, I don't know, World War III, like mentioned earlier, where like this game theoretic reasoning is no longer there. How do we then start like setting constraints on these type of things? And is this going to happen in protocol or out of protocol? It seems like everything is just easier out of protocol. Mentioned earlier, like we can do things faster somehow. That seems easier out of protocol.
Yeah, I mean, it seems out of protocol it's easier. Like it doesn't seem that there's any, at least I don't know of any robust way to constrain these things as of right now. Definitely the dominant way to like constrain these things right now is through your social pressure of like if people start doing things that are bad, people get mad, and then like you see those dynamics play out. And it's, I mean, I think it's a kind of an open question of like, are there economically robust mechanisms or incentives you can set up that structure the market in such a way that people are actually constrained against doing these like bad things? And we have that to some extent, right? Of like double spending just prevented against in the protocol. And so there's like certain classes of like bad actions that we know that like we can deterministically say are bad and kind of prevent. But the problem is a lot of these economic things, like we don't have the counterfactuals, like kind of Max was pointing to earlier, where if you don't have the counterfactuals, it's hard to say exactly, were you being malicious? Were you just being kind of doing things arbitrarily and things looked a certain way? And so right now we kind of rely on more social things to say, oh, like like the kind of eye test, does it look bad or not bad? And we kind of let most things fly right now. It gets in a permissionless environment. That's kind of the only thing you can do. And yeah, so I don't have any great solutions for how we constrain these things to kind of, as Max was kind of alluding to, kind of separate what is like extractive behavior, what's kind of welfare editing behavior, how do we constrain away the extractive stuff while allowing the kind of good stuff? It's very tricky, and I don't have any great answers for it right now.
Lily?
Yeah, I think like the type of systems you're able to build like out of protocol, like for example, you mentioned like pre-comps, like that is a lot of the pre-comp systems like today seem like poorly designed because like they assume that a lot of people are actually going to opt in into like the proposers are going to say like, yeah, I'm going to like opt in and like use this like gateway or use this like new commit boost like sidecar. But it's like if you have like only like 90% of like validators like opting into the system, like that system cannot like provide like 100% like uptime guarantees. So just the out of protocol systems that you were like building, like if you can't have them in protocol, meaning like 100% like uptime, like you're gonna just have like weaker, like shittier systems as a result of trying to do like out of protocol instead of like in protocol.
And if they're in protocol, constraining them, as you mentioned earlier, also seems to be a lot easier as well. But it seems like the way it's coming in protocol seems way slower than out of protocol, which I guess is the issue. So you're incentivized to do it out of protocol because you're going to make more money or... Yeah.
I think this is like a really good point. If you look at Ethereum, we have about 92% of blocks built by PBS. And because PBS is so much easier to interact with than the public mempool solution, the blocks that are not built by PBS are actually much less full. And it's almost as if we skip those slots, which is not good for network performance at all. So in some ways, one advantage of enshrining these things into the protocol is that you don't have to deal with basically 8% of slots missed because some solo staker, for whatever reason, didn't want to subscribe to PBS. I think something we should think about for sure.
And when you say enshrining this, do you mean like unsophisticated like proposers doing building, or do you mean like enshrining the builders themselves here?
I mean, I'm just saying enshrining. If you have an out-of-protocol system, then even if you have a super majority like 92%, you still have the problem that the other 8% are not signed up. And then everybody needs to either build a different system to interact with those proposers or what they're doing right now, which is often just ignoring those proposers and going on with their day, which effectively is a missed slot.
Yeah, but it seems like even if like MEF boosts or like a PPS thing is enshrined, like these unsophisticated or like less efficient actors wouldn't be able to like do as good of a job as the 2 or /3 like extremely sophisticated ones.
Well, I think ideally you could enshrine PBS into the protocol, right? This is not necessarily so far from possibility. It wouldn't be the case that you enshrine it and then like Beaver is no longer allowed to build blocks anymore. It would just be you enshrine it and then Beaver can build blocks, but you basically force everybody to participate in the system, which currently only 92% are participating in.
Yeah, and some of these sort of constraints we can do in protocol. Let's take, for example, like a shared sequencer network. You mentioned like applications specifically can like set like validity rules for how they want to do these things. Can the shared sequencers also like insert like specific rules about how things, like an inclusion list for, forced inclusion or something? Is that something you're looking at? And is, I guess, the other question to the other two, like how is this happening on Ethereum as well?
Yeah, so like at Astria, like we are like working on a block builder right now for like our own EVM, but we're doing like a top of block and like a rest of block. So we'd have like a top of block like containing like an MEV bundle, but then the rest of the block could like theoretically people could just like have their transaction sequenced directly by the sequencer instead of being included in the top of block bundle. So there's like more like I guess like wiggle room and like rollups when they're designing their own like VMs and like deterministic like sequencing rules. They could have like different like inclusion paths into their block controlled by like different actors. There's also like an idea of like an app can like control like its own state route, like on an app chain, so it has total control over like what goes in and what goes out. So they can like theoretically just design the system however they would like it to operate without like having to like interact with like outside entity to like exert force over the ordering.
Do you want to touch a little bit on inclusion lists on Ethereum or no?
I will just say that it's basically censorship is not part of the forensic support. What do I mean by that? It's not something that you can slash, because to slash something you need to prove that it happened. For censorship to happen, it has to be the case that the censoring party saw the transaction, it was valid, and they didn't include it. Well, we can obviously see whether they didn't include it, but we can't really tell whether in their local view they saw the transaction. And so you need to do basically a bunch of work to get censorship into the local view and try to slash them. And I think this is like quite hard. So that's why a lot of the inclusion list designs and multi-proposer designs are designed to make it so that censoring is not profitable rather than censoring is slashable, which is a much harder problem.
Anything to add on this, Pranav?
No.
All right, so it seems to be a trend here in these two answers that we're gonna get like split up blocks, maybe into like bundles or into like application specific bundles, or maybe into like priority versus non-priority. Can you give us like a TLDR on like what multi-concurrent proposers are? Because I feel like it's a good place to start with going into this thing about like splitting up blocks and like doing different things in different parts of it.
Yeah, I think the basic design is that if you have a proposer monopoly, the best thing to do about it is to get rid of it. And so you want to make one proposer and turn it into many proposers. And each of the proposers will propose a set of transactions. We will take the union of all of them, so we will dedupe them. And then we'll apply a deterministic ordering rule, of which there are many candidates at the moment. We'll choose the best one at the end, and then we will order the transactions that way, and that will be your execution block. So your execution block will no longer be ordered by the proposers, it will be ordered by a deterministic rule, and your inclusion will no longer be determined by one proposer, but by many proposers. And so MEV, which is censorship and reordering, will go away almost entirely.
I'm not totally certain that there's like a rule that would exist that would like eliminate like most forms or all forms like MEV. Like specifically thinking about like an auction for like a non-divisible like item, like consider like an NFT. Like how can you like run like an auction like on chain with like multiple like concurrent proposers that would like effectively like auction off this NFT to like the highest bidder if people can see the transactions that are being included in the block?
Do you want to take this one on the DSIC indivisible good case?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the NFT example, it's one of the easier ones in the case that like the ordering doesn't, like the ordering of the bids in the block aren't as important. I mean, I think there the tricky thing is like how much visibility you have in the mempool and what's the auction design, which is kind of separate from like the block building problem. It's kind of either, even in like a single proposer case or multiple proposer case, really whatever you do, if you're running a first price type of auction and you see floating bids before the auction is ended, that'll be a problem regardless of what the block builder is doing. And so I think this is kind of an interesting point for the multi-proposer case of, I mean, Max has talked about this before, of kind of moving to more asynchronous designs for apps compared to things that are kind of based on ordering. And I think auctions are one of the auctions that aren't super short time periods are actually easier in this respect of kind of, the order you accept bids in doesn't matter until like the actual auction finishes. And so I think it's an open question kind of, and like to what extent can we like have this paradigm for kind of more and more different like types of applications basically. And kind of the more applications that you can kind of have in this kind of asynchronous environment where you're fine just accepting orders and kind of it doesn't matter what order you do things in. That's kind of like the dream case I'd say for this kind of infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Max.
Just to quickly answer the question, just to summarize, like you run an auction basically. You have a single indivisible good. You run a first price auction or a second price auction, and this turns out to be efficient. Especially the second price auction is like guaranteed efficient and DSIC. So if you care about that, like I know Pranav does, then you can get that as well.
Wait, what does DSIC mean? Just for
Dominant strategy incentive compatible.
so like what if like two bids come in at the same price? Like how do you like apply like an ordering rule to like two bids that both win? Like there's just like these like little small edge cases that like holistic like transaction ordering rule just like kind of break down in my minds.
That was my next question, so thank you, Lily.
I mean, in the theory, we usually break ties randomly or based on some deterministic tie-breaking rule, but usually these issues don't come up very much because in a second price auction, if you put in your true value, then somebody else also puts in that value. You're kind of indifferent between winning the item and paying your value for the item or not winning the item at all, and so you don't really care.
So this sort of conflicting contentious state, how can we fix this? Like if we have these sort of lanes with different type of contentious state, how do we sort of deal with this? Do we need like some last look like shared sequencer that can sort of decide on the final order? Like how do we deal with like contentious state across different like concurrent proposers?
Well, the proposers don't touch the state directly. They can touch the state by including transactions. And so the ordering rule is what actually is allowed to touch the state. And that happens like after we are sure about what the views of each of the proposers was. So basically, after we have finality, we can be 100% sure what each of the proposers said was their transactions, and we can order them according to a deterministic rule, and that's how you deal with the conflicts.
What if I don't want to be ordered unless I'm first? Can I also do that? But what if it seems like there's a bit of a difference there?
Yeah, I think if you have, I mean, this is all about what the ordering rule is, and this is why I say there's multiple ordering rules available. One ordering rule would be just order them by the priority fee in decreasing order of priority fee. And of course, that has the issue that you're talking about, which is that you have basically all pay auction, where if you don't win, if you're not the first person, then you end up having to pay your bid, and this is quite annoying for searchers, although I don't think it's too bad in the end, although the searchers will complain in your Telegram if you do this. The other ordering rules that are suggested are different ordering rules. One of them, which approximates kind of a first price auction, where you don't get ordered if your transaction would fail in the ordering. One of them is designed for like order agnostic apps, so you wouldn't have to pay too much for the ordering because all of the bids get processed at the same time. And so it's really a question for the ordering rule, which is something that the mechanism designers can deal with.
I actually think that single proposers have like a lot of like value in the sense that they can do like spam protection, or I guess like block builders on Ethereum today like offer bundles where it's like if your like transaction reverts, we're not going to put it on the chain. So it's like builders and single proposers, they were able to like offer services to people that like multiple like concurrent proposers like couldn't do, like including just like the general problem. Like let's say that I want to like attack the network. Like let's say that like there's 16 proposers. I give every proposer like a transaction with the same nonce with my signer, but like all the transactions are like actually different. Like there's no way that the proposers like would know that like this one transaction like is actually like only one of the 16 is going to like actually like land on chain just because of the nonce invalidation problem. I just think that the multiple concurrent proposers, there's a lot of like technical like difficulties of applying this to at least like a generalized like EVM like architecture.
Well, I think, first of all, we have a data availability gadget that solves this problem that you're talking about, the free DA attack. Basically, you have to require that when a transaction goes into one of the proposer's blocks, the maximum fee it could pay is available, and in fact, the maximum fee times the number of proposers is available there. So then you can guarantee that at least if it gets in, it's going to be able to pay the fee, even if they do the attack that Lily was describing, which is an important attack to think about, of doing 16 different things with different nonces. Of course, you have to then execute things with different nonces, but that's another question that the coders can deal with.
I guess an Ethereum transaction though, like when it's like run on chain, it could actually like send out the remaining of its balance to like some other account. Like an account can like self-destruct or like self-drain like on chain, like invalidating like the rest of the transactions or just.
Well, that's why the ordering rule, the first thing the ordering rule does before it executes anything is to process the fees and in fact hold them in escrow until the end of the block when it returns them, so that you don't have this free DA problem.
I mean, I think there's kind of a more fundamental trade-off here we're kind of getting at with this kind of attack, and it's basically kind of having a single proposer architecture. What it allows you to do is kind of take these like very complex inputs and kind of preferences by various agents and say, you know, I can make the promise to you, I will like satisfy these like complex requirements over state. But kind of the power to do that is what lets that same proposer kind of extract rents, right? And so this is kind of like fundamental. Like if the proposer has a monopoly power over controlling the state, they can, on one hand, kind of offer strong guarantees and make very efficient promises to users and efficiently use block space. On the other hand, they can abuse that control of the state to like extract rent for themselves. And kind of, I think, how I think a multi-proposer is kind of explicitly like taking the stance that we're willing to give up efficiency to some extent. We will have more wasted block space. We will have transactions go multiple blocks. We cannot make the same guarantees to you. And what we buy with that is we say the proposer no longer has this control to extract rents anymore. And they can still extract rents to some extent, but basically you're picking this point in trade-off space. And I think in understanding like, is this like kind of the right architecture moving forward, I think it's really understanding like, is this trade-off worth it? And it buys you some things, lose you some things. I think this is like, it's kind of fundamental, and you're kind of forced to do with the bad, with whatever path you go down.
I kind of like the idea of like actually having like proposers or like I guess like block builders for specific applications being run in like a TEE, so that when you're like using an application, you can like know it's like, okay, cool, like this like proposer or like block builder's not actually extracting any rent. Like these are the rules that they like are following. So there's like trade-offs like, oh, TEEs are like hackable, but just like it's like one of the previous talks was saying like TEEs are like great for block building where you don't really care if like state is like leaked because of the short-term value. The state is just like every like block. That's like the time span that the state actually matters. But I feel like we could have single proposers that behave nicely with like TEs or just like other like properties. So I don't think like multiple concurrent proposers necessarily is like better than like a single proposer.
Well, how can you force the proposers to run in a TE, right? And this is in an Ethereum type network. If your network consists of 100 nodes in a Telegram channel, then I'm sure you can get them to, put them in a box, which is a TE. But if it's Ethereum with 800,000 validators, but actually only 8,800, but still like you can run whatever you want. All we can do is see which messages you post. And if somebody doesn't want to run in a TE or wants to, like modify their TE to make profit, like we're not going to be able to stop them from doing that.
So if that's the actual number, then it seems like we just might make more sense to just revert to the Solana setup where you have like the app-specific sequencing, you have like local fee markets, and you might also have a pretty like this decentralized setup. It's just a little bit more cranked up in terms of hardware. That kind of seems like the route we're going down. Like if we think about we want like app-specific sequencing, we want like multi-concurrent proposers, maybe we want like continuous blocks or something. It seems to be going down that route, or am I completely off the hook here?
I mean, I think we have some of the same ideas because they're the right ideas. But I don't think we're going down exactly the same path. As I talked to Anatoly like last week about this. I think we have some fundamental disagreements about what multiple proposers is for. He often thinks of it as being about throughput, about distance in terms of latency to the nearest leader, whereas I'm very concerned about censorship resistance. So I think that we have some fundamental disagreements, but at the same time, the thing we agreed on the call was basically, if you have a monopoly and it's causing a bunch of problems, the thing to do is to get rid of it. And that's also one of the reasons that they want multi-proposer as well, although it might not just be for the censorship reason that I'm concerned about.
Is there a world where multi-concurrent proposers hurts efficiency? Because if you have more proposers, you probably have more unsophisticated proposers being active. That seems to go against like an efficient market setup.
Oh, I think it's absolutely going to be a trade-off between efficiency, as Pranav said. I just think if you look at the other side, which is what we're gaining, I think it's so important. I was retweeting last night like 20 blocks in a row, each over 10 ETH of PBS auction value, many over 100 ETH. And that is just like basically an exploit level attack on Ethereum users happened last night. Aave made $6 million on liquidations. I wonder how much the proposers made, probably a lot more than that. And I think we just like cannot have that continue to happen on our chain where all this money is getting sucked out to people whose only reason for getting the money is that they have an Ethereum node that was operating in the monopoly for that 12-second window.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty fair like way of looking at it. I don't think we've mentioned threats specifically, to some extent, perhaps. Is that something that we're like looking at elsewhere where like, oh, shreds on Solana might be pretty cool?
I mean, like shreds aren't really incident compatible in any way. They kind of, I kind of refrain from taking the way things work on Solana and kind of saying like that's an ideal market structure. So I think they have a lot of good ideas. They do have a lot of good engineering. A lot of the things they do are not incident compatible, are not the way you'd expect the market to stay if you would wait 1, 2, 3 years, basically. And shreds are one example of this, where like, proof of history makes them like somewhat constrained to being something compatible, but like really like if these validators were like really being kind of optimizing their value, they just wait for the end of their slots and like propose these big blocks, right? And they wouldn't do the shred thing. Even running local fee markets, like a lot of these things are kind of just the client is written in a certain way, everybody follows the client, and they kind of, right now, they're in nice equilibria where things are working pretty well. But I think like the Ethereum role looks pretty different. I think the kind of norms in Ethereum are a bit different in terms of what you're allowed to do as long as it stays within the protocol. And I think that community has their own problems they're working towards. They're trying to do research and figure out like how can we make these mechanisms more robust, more stable long term. And so something, I mean, shreds in some sense is just like making the atomic unit of like block production different from the atomic unit of consensus, which I think is like an interesting research direction. But I think there's still a lot more work before you can like clearly say like that's the way forward and like how you implement it optimally.
I don't even think the Solana people would recommend we use shreds. I think it's pretty cooked.
Maybe one sort of dream world. I don't know if you guys agree, but I mean, let me know if you don't. It seems like a dream world is where like each like app that has like somewhat of a valuable bundle just like do their own bundling and then like send that off, and like builders have to include it because otherwise they'll lose the block auction. Is that like a road out where like apps become the builders and we don't trust like 2 or 3 dudes?
It's not really obvious what that means. I mean, one way you could interpret that is like the DApp is just written better to kind of like not need block building to settle things. Like this is kind of a version of you just have an async DApp that doesn't care about the ordering of transactions. It just, you know, once a block, it runs some logic and then clears all the trades or something like this. In that sense, the gas would be higher, blah, blah, blah. Maybe gas is cheap, this isn't a problem. And like the app itself is just doing the building. You know, a different version of this question is like, does every front end just have a default bundler attached to it? And like, you know, that front end makes these bundles to then trust some other party. And like this rule is a bit less appealing to me. I mean, basically you can imagine you start adding point centralization and now like basically only like certain paths through the mempool are valid for different apps, which maybe it works, but it's a bit unsatisfying. And yeah, and then you also hurt composability with some of these things, right? The more you kind of restrain how transactions can be bundled, how they can be executed, the harder it is. I think one of the really cool things of DeFi is the composability. And so is harming that worth it for better UX in terms of having less MEV? Maybe. Yeah, I think it's a lot to be seen still.
Yeah, so like I actually have an EIP that would like enable like apps to write their own bundles and do their own sequencings with like an off-chain entity through like delegation. I was tabling this like I guess like this EIP just to see how it would like interplay with like multiple concurrent proposers. But this like EIP would like allow like an app like Uniswap to say it's like unless this like specific transaction was like sequenced by this like outside entity and put into a bundle, this transaction cannot run through this like piece of state. It just allows like a Ethereum like on-chain applications to have partial control over their state roots. And there's like certain ways where you'd want to like write these applications so that like users can like remove their like liquidity if they wanted to, not through being sequenced through the, I guess, the app-specific sequencer, just for like safety reasons. But yeah, it also like does reduce the amount of composability that like apps would be able to express. But like I would like love to see statistics on like how many like DeFi like, I guess like actions are actually like cross DeFi like application, because like DeFi like composability like it's cool, but I would love to see statistics on how much it's like actually used.
Well, it's not used by users, it's used by searchers, so.
Do we like searchers?
No. We're not in the business of making searchers' life easier, although I think some people in Mev world have made that their mission in life. But my mission in life is actually to make the chain better and have better equilibria. And the sophisticated entities run by like people who used to be at high-frequency trading firms or are still at high-frequency trading firms probably can deal with a little bit of complexity.
But if we assume that the proposers are the chain, then they would want, I'd assume, to keep most of this MEV in the hands of themselves, no?
Well, I think like as the chain, do we want to extract as much rent in the short term, or do we want to build a big pie in the long term that maybe necessitates us not raking as much? In my opinion, Ethereum or any chain should not try to extract as much rent as possible in the short term. It should build for long-term growth and basically build to onboard people who actually want to use the chain, and then take a very small, slight bit of rent from there to sustain the chain.
It just seems like apart from the holy home stakers, the vast majority of the proposers are companies that are trying to maximize value, right?
Yeah, but Ethereum is not a business. Ethereum is not a profit maximizing business. People who built Ethereum made a lot of money from holding ETH, but the goal of Ethereum is not to maximize money. It is to build a settlement layer that can replace the global financial system and bank the unbanked or whatever. And I don't think that that is a coherent thing to say at the same time as saying we want to make this thing as extractive as possible for the proposers who run our nodes. If people don't want to run the nodes, then they can stop, and we will get other people who will be willing to run them for cheaper.
Yeah, it's pretty fair. I'm going to open up the sort of stage for anybody in the audience that want to ask something. I feel like we might have questions here. It would make sense, at least. We have one over here.
Make sure you wait for the mic to come.
Wait for the mic first, and then ask the question.
Cool. I'm curious, like, in a world with multiple proposers and the execution layer doing the ordering, do you even need builders at that point if they're just doing inclusion?
I think the role of the builder will be substantially reduced, but the people who run builders will have plenty of things to work on in other capacities. They will be able to actually focus on their trading strategies rather than on acquiring private order flow.
So if you guys see a world where every application is like asynchronously interoperable, running their own OFAs, then unless the base layer is super fast, then that just increases confirmation times for the actual transaction bundle to go through, right? But then at what point are we going to be okay, yeah, I want actual consumers to use this instead of just DeFi whales who are okay with waiting 12 seconds for the transaction to go through, say, multiple iterations of okay, DeFi app 1 OFA, DeFi app 2 OFA, versus oh, I just want 400 millisecond or very fast confirmations as if I'm using a web app.
Like if an app is fully sequencing itself, the probability of it being able to say yes, this transaction is going to be included in the next block and we'll go through is much easier because it's operating on a partially or completely known state route depending on how the application wants to define its own sequencing. So at that level, it's yeah, you can offer pre-comps easier on an app level instead of a global Ethereum block level.
Also, multiple proposers allows you to have faster block times because one of the things that's hard about block times, getting them shorter, is rotating the proposer. And when you take away the monopoly power, rotating isn't as important. So you can have the same set of nodes proposing, say, 6 blocks in a 12-second window, then you have 2-second block times instead of 12 seconds.
As point of clarification is more so Max, you mentioned searchers care about atomicity versus users don't, but then users do care about, say, chaining or course of actions, right? And if each course of action requires settlement of the OFA into the block, then say, for example, I have something that chains 6 DeFi actions together, then I need 6 blocks and to settle all the auctions. But then, where do you want to get to a point where, okay, actually users get transaction confirmations in, less than a second, where it's okay, I use the web, I click on a website, boom, it opens up, versus okay, today, yeah, it's 12 seconds. If we have 2-second block times and 6 sequential auctions, yeah, that's equal. But then what if we want to make it better, right?
Well, I guess the question is how many users actually do 6 things in a row on chain? I think not very many.
Any other questions? Oh, do we have time for more questions, Josh?
We can go another 5 minutes and then Barry. Are you already mic'd up? Okay.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion of what goals are we optimizing for and how that relates to market structure. And so there's been, Max said, banking the unbanked or whatever. You also talked about the non-MEV boost blocks being kind of essentially empty slots versus the MEV boost slots being full. I think Pranav talked about the MEV boost mechanism kind of maximizing proposer revenue. Or was that Mads? I don't remember. But yeah, there's kind of a lot of different notions of what's better, right? Either kind of a welfare notion or a profit maximizing notion or kind of a fairness for inclusion, all these kinds of different goals. I'm curious, how do you guys kind of I guess, what is good in your opinion and which things are more important, how that relates to the market structure that we should aim for, I guess, kind of in because I feel we're kind of talking about a lot of things at the same time, so it'd be interesting to
My utility function for the chain is what can get us to euro-dollar supremacy on chain the fastest. And I think I'm okay with a few failed transactions. In TradFi, in central limit order books, you have 18 times as many cancels as you have fills, which is like fine because they have enough infrastructure to support it and it actually gives great properties. I think we can maybe do even better, but that's kind of my goal is basically how do we get there? How do we advance to that stage?
I guess like my definition of good is more on the level of the application. Like, is the application able to give and capture all the value that's flowing through it back to the users who are participating in the application? Like, it'd be great if like Uniswap could like actually capture like all the arbitrage value for like its actual like LPs. Like, I think like crypto is like supposed to like benefit the decentralized users who are part of the user base and not like outside entities. So I guess like my like utility function is like, are application developers like able to like fully capture like all of the market, I guess like inefficiencies or just like the time value like arbitrage that exists within their own application.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer. I mean, as a theory person, just like vaguely welfare seems good. What that means is, of course, very ambiguous. I think to me, it's just like blockchains are very cool. They're these, these very interesting like economic coordination mechanisms, and they can let you coordinate on types of state that you can't do in like normal TradFi. And so insofar as that like coordination like results in like gains from trade and like broader welfare for everybody, it seems quite good. Of course, it's pretty thorny, and that doesn't mean too much in practice, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably echo Lele a little bit. Like, I think it's dependent on the app specifically. Like, as a very abstract example is like, let's say I have two fingers and I'm playing an on-chain game. And like, this finger is paying more than this finger, but like, this finger pressed the button first. Like, I want to move left or right. Like, I probably don't want to be the opposite way around, right? Like, I think it's very dependent of what I'm saying. It's very dependent on what like specific app you're dealing with. It could also be like fairness. It doesn't have to be like get us as most value out there as possible. So it seems kind of up to the app at the end of the day. I think we have one more hand here. Oh, two more.
Yeah, so there's kind of this sentiment that every ecosystem is going to prioritize max extraction if the value's there. But what we're seeing with the centralized sequencer L2s today is that some of them are actually prioritizing growth over that max extracting users, whether it be like Arbitrum decreasing its min base fee or base increasing its target gas per block. Does that change kind of your overarching structure of how you're thinking about Ethereum MEV? And yeah.
Wait, so we're talking about centralized sequencers that aren't extracting MEV, and you just mentioned base and Arbitrum, which are the ones that are actually doing the most to extract MEV, with time boost and with base charging way higher fees than the L1 is actually charging them for. Like, they're not passing on the savings to their users. I mean, maybe I can get behind you if you talk about optimism, but like these two are the worst examples that you could have chosen because those are the ones that are actively signaling to the market that they want to optimize for short-term revenue over growth, in my opinion.
They also have like a reputation game that they're playing. So if they were like extracting a ton of like money from their users, like I guess they are, but like now that we know that, maybe everyone's gonna go use like optimism. But just like the idea that like they're a known entity, so if they do bad things, people won't use them. Like people have like choice and like can like move away from things. So if you're like a specific entity doing something bad, that you're not participating in like a PB like a PBS or just like an auction that like allows like anyone in. If you're just like acting and interacting with like users directly, like I feel like your reputation matters, and that's why like maybe they're not doing like super bad things to their users.
Yeah, so in general, market design is much easier when you have trusted parties that can commit to various strategies. And centralized sequencers are great at that. I think that the key challenge is how do we make these things work in a permissionless environment?
And Max, just clarifying your point on like base and Arbitrum, right? What you're saying is that like the cost they have to pay to the L1 to like submit data and whatever, right? They are charging like a higher margin than like Optimism on that. So they may not be like extracting value through like front running transactions or searching or whatever, but fundamentally because they're a centralized entity, the mechanism by which they make profit is just by increasing their base fee. And so in aggregate, they are extracting more value from the overall functioning of the system.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, that's what I mean about base. Your summary was exactly what I'm saying about base. Arbitrum has time boost, which I think is actually much worse, but that is basically an extractive system that is an alternative to PBS for continuous time, where they basically charge you to go faster, and that's a way to make money off arbitrage and take rent out of the system.
So I have a question about two things that Max brought up. One was a prediction that any system with enough MEV will converge to MEV boost. And another is that we might be able to fight this with multi-proposer protocols where each proposer proposes like little sub-blocks which are then combined somehow. It sounds like having a set of proposers who each propose smaller units, which I'm just going to, for the sake of words, call blocks, and then they get ordered somehow. How is that different in terms of likeliness to converge to MEV boost? It sounds a lot like proposers building blocks or proposing blocks.
I mean, you may have a system which helps them build their own block. You could even have a system where they all collude together, although this would be not a great situation. My defense of why it will not converge to basically everybody colluding is, first of all, if everybody colludes, what are we doing? It's a blockchain. If everybody colludes, they could double spend. So clearly there are some things that we can do where not everybody will collude together. The other defense is basically you have certain entities who have incentives for the chain to run well. For example, Coinbase does not want Ethereum to be fundamentally broken. I work at Consensus. We don't want the chain to be fundamentally broken. We control 3% of the nodes. Coinbase controls like 27% or whatever. So if one of us is in the multi-proposer set, we're going to be able to break up the collusion there because it's a one-of-n property. As long as one of us is not colluding, then we're going to be able to break up the collusion. So I really am not too worried about it. And again, if you have 30% honest and you only need one of them to be in, that's actually a pretty high probability.
But that's true if your honest nodes are occasionally proposers as well. The difference here is that they are proposing smaller pieces more frequently?
No, it's not exactly true if your honest nodes are occasionally proposers, because the 70% of the time, say 30% of the network is honest, in this case, they're not participating in collude boost or whatever, then that would be actually a very small percentage of slots in which there's no honest node participating, as K grows even smaller, right? But currently, if you have like a single proposer architecture, it's going to be 70% of slots where the proposer is not.
Right, but the honest nodes only get to propose a small portion of those majority of blocks in which they participate.
Yeah, but the whole point is basically because they can't censor, now you have competition for the liquidation or whatever valuable items are available in that slot. And so actually one of n is enough to get rid of the huge extraction power that the monopoly provides.
I guess does Consensus and Coinbase run MEV boost?
Yeah, we do run MEV boost because it's a unilateral thing that we do, basically. I mean, if we participate in a system that, like, we don't think that we can change the whole equilibrium of the system by not participating in MEV boost. Whereas in this situation, I think actually Coinbase could change the whole equilibrium of the system because it's a one-of-n property and they're 27% of the network.
We do have to move on to the next talk. I know it is MEV. It is a fun debate. We can have it. We've been having it for years now. We can find more time during the happy hour at other events this week. Thank you to the speakers here, the panelists.